So now that we're in Unreal and we've got our tire here, let's take a look at setting up some materials. Like we had seen in the previous lesson, it actually brought in our tire material because it recognized on the FBX model that this model does actually have a material ID. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we first need to bring in the textures to use on this material. So let's right click again and import. And we'll make sure that we select the albedo, the DirectX, again, Unreal uses the DirectX normal format, and the RMA image. So it's going to bring all of our textures in, which is going to be awesome. And there's one final thing I'd like to do on these textures. If I come on over to the RMA map and I double click, that's going to open up an image browser here for us. And we can even take a look at the individual channels like the blue, the green, and the red. And I want to come on down to where it says compression and compression settings. And I'd like to change this from default to masks. And that's going to be the way that we're going to be utilizing this texture, right? Each individual channel is effectively kind of like a mask or its own texture map. And that's how we're going to be utilizing it in the material. So I'm going to go up to the top left and click on save. And I'll also just select these both and hit Control S. So now we can head on over to our material, and it's going to open up the material editor here, or the browser. Now the first thing you might try to do is middle mouse click to pan around, and that's not going to work for you. The way that we kind of pan around in this material editor is by right clicking and dragging. So just be aware of that. The middle mouse button is not going to do anything for you here. Now, hopefully this kind of looks a little familiar. Most 3D software now utilize this node-based system for shading or creating materials, and we saw something very similar to this in Blender. So what we're going to want to do is bring in our textures as nodes here, and then we're going to start plugging them into this tire master shader node. So I can get rid of this parameter there. And I want to bring in those textures to our graph. So there's a couple different ways we can do that. The first way being, again, dragging and dropping that texture from our content browser. And that's probably the easiest way to do it if you have it, easily accessible. Another way to do it is if we right click, just click, not press and hold, we can start to look for a texture sample node. Now it's not going to put the correct, normal map or RMA image into that. We'll take a look at how to do that in a second. And finally, the last way, and it's also another relatively easy way, is by holding down the T key on your keyboard and then just single clicking, left clicking in the graph. So again, if I just hold down T and then I left click, it's going to bring in a texture sample node. Okay, so now we have our 3 texture nodes, but we don't have 3 different textures actually supplied to those. So if I click on our second texture sample here, over on the left-hand side, we can see that we have a couple of options here. So I'm going to click on the tire albedo, and I'm going to switch this over to our DirectX. And you'll notice that it actually switched the sampler type from color to normal because it knows that this texture is actually associated with the normal map format. And again, that's something that Unreal did on import of this texture. It was just smart enough to know that this was a normal map. We'll also do the same for our bottom socket here. So let's go and click on RMA. And again, remember we went and switched the compression mode over to masks. So Unreal knows that we also want to use this type of sampler for this particular texture. All right, so now this is going to be pretty similar to setting up a material in Blender. We're going to take the RGB, final image composition for our color and plug that into our base color. And you'll see that it's going to start to pop up here on the left-hand side. And actually what we can do is also view the tire in our little preview there. So let's go and select that static mesh. And then if I come on over to our 3D view here, hopefully you can kind of see this. There's like a little cinder block but it's going to set the preview to the mesh that we have selected in our content browser. So when I click on that, now we're going to be able to actually visualize our tire. We'll go and plug in the normal map output as well into our normal socket. And now we're going to get some of those, nice like ridges in our tire, which is going to look really cool. And then finally, we're going to use our roughness, metallic, and AO texture. Unreal kind of supplies us with a much easier way to get at each of those individual channels, right? We have socket outputs for each one of those. So we're not going to need to use that separate color or RGB XYZ node like we had to in Blender. So this is really handy. So R for roughness, let's go and plug that in. G for gunmetal, so we'll go and plug that into the metallic, and B for ambient occlusion. And once we've got that, let's go and just save this material up in the top left. And you want to make sure that you save it or either apply, because if you don't, it won't actually show up in our 3D view. Now if I exit out of there, we can see that we've got our tire with a material all set up, and it's looking pretty sweet. So that's going to be pretty much all we're going to be doing in Unreal Engine. Again, setting up models and materials and stuff in this engine could be an entire course in and of itself. But before we close out, I wanted to show you how we can just play around with the directional lighting in this scene, just to give you some more familiarity with playing around in the 3D world and just changing, a pretty big component of what's going on in our viewport here. So we're going to have this outliner tab over here on the right hand side, and if we click that, it's going to open up the outliner for everything that's in our 3D view. So this is going to act pretty much the exact same as our outliner did in Blender, where we were adding all of our objects. So this is basically everything that we can see in our 3D view here. So if we click on the directional light, that's going to give us these gizmos here, and I'll just click and move this over. And so this is the directional sun lamp like we had in Blender. So if I change my gizmo mode to rotate, and I start to rotate this, you'll see that our environment's going to update, as well as the lighting on the actual tire itself. So we can go and give this some pretty cool looking dynamic lighting. With this directional light selected, if I come over to the details panel, this is where I'm going to be able to play around with, again, the rotation of this if I wanted to. And actually, of course, the x-axis isn't going to do anything. But if I, play around with the y, you can see that it's going to have different colors depending on the position of the sun, just because of how the Unreal shaders work. It uses this kind of time of day effect, which is really cool. And I'll just crank that back down. So we're going to get some, more daytime lighting. I can also change the temperature of the sun. Make it a little bit warmer, a little bit cooler. We can change the intensity. So if I wanted a really, really low intensity sun, something like 2 or something like 20, which is going to be really, really bright. Maybe I'll set that to like 15. We can also change the light color as well, which is really handy. So we can have a kind of like a Mars atmosphere if we wanted to make it like orangey or kind of like a dusk tone. And there's just going to be a whole slew of different options, which again, reading some documentation, finding some videos online is going to really help you out here. But this is going to be a very quick and easy way for you to start playing around with the Unreal Engine and just get comfortable with navigating some of the menus and such.